So recently, I had this absolutely unexpected opportunity when a friend that I know through the history guy was invited to the White House Christmas party and sent me a text that said, "Hey, you want to come?" Uh, I know that the White House seems like new construction by European standards. Heck, I've stood on bridges that were built 1,000 years before Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But the White House, which this year celebrates 225 years as the president's residence, represents the history of this nation. A history that can be counted in Christmas celebrations. And even though my part in that history is tiny, insignificant, I understand that it was a piece that I didn't want to pass up. And I want to tell you about it. In 1792, a competition was held under the direction of Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson and President George Washington, pursuant to the Residence Act of 1790, to build a mansion for the president in the nation's new capital. Architect James Hoban's design was chosen. The cornerstone was laid in 1792 and has, in an enduring mystery of history, never been seen since. Work proceeded under Washington's supervision, and yes, while numerous laborers and craftsmen participated in the construction, enslaved people were a significant part of the quarrying of the stone and construction of the building. Not all history is what we would prefer it to be. The building was faced in sandstone, which is a porous material, and in 1798 the facade was painted with whitewash to protect the porous stone from freezing. The unfinished mansion almost immediately started to be called the White House. So, no, what you might have heard isn't true. The name was not because the building was burned in 1814 and painted white to cover up the scorch marks. It was unofficially called the White House more than a decade before that, and not officially called the White House for nearly a century after. Washington would never sleep in the residence whose construction he oversaw. After 8 years of construction, the house was first occupied by President John Adams on November 1st, 1800. The president had moved there ahead of his wife, Abigail, and on November 2nd, he wrote her a letter. Included in it was a simple blessing. "I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house, and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." It was at that point a lofty aspiration. The city of Washington was muddy. Of the great buildings and monuments to come, only one wing of the Capitol building had been completed, with a long muddy road to the unfinished mansion. The building that I would visit 2.25 centuries later was unfinished, described as damp and drafty, despite its 13 fireplaces. There was virtually no furniture. The floor plan was different than it is today. And a month later, the tradition of Christmas at the White House began. The White House Historical Association explains the first White House Christmas party was held in December 1800 by President John Adams and First Lady Abigail Adams for their 4-year-old granddaughter, Susanna Boylston Adams. The first family invited government officials and their children to the party. The party was held in what was then called the Grand Ballroom. It's today called the East Room. The annual Christmas party is still hosted in that room today. Contemporary accounts say that the party included a small orchestra and guests sang carols and played games. A squabble was said to have occurred between the young guest of honor and another child over an accidentally broken plate. Various accounts exist, but the gist is that Susanna, angry over the broken plate, bit the nose off the other girl's doll. The president had to intervene and make peace. The president might have been amused, but the small fight at Christmas might have symbolized the nation still finding its footing, still squabbling over broken things. And it wouldn't be the last squabble in the People's House. Still, the Virginia Institute for American History writes the affair was planned in large part by the vivacious First Lady Abigail Adams and was considered a great success. The very celebration of Christmas was in flux. The bulk of the traditions we recognize today hadn't been established, and the day was not yet even universally celebrated in the United States. The holiday was celebrated in many ways under various presidents, and records were not always clear. The White House Historical Association writes that before the 20th century, Christmas was not an official event. First families decorated the house modestly with greens and privately celebrated the Yuletide with family and friends. That's not to say there weren't celebrations, however, they weren't all necessarily well documented. Thomas Jefferson was, according to the webpage of Jefferson's Monticello, particularly fond of Christmas, writing in a letter in 1762 that Christmas was the day of greatest mirth and jollity. But the website White House Christmas Cards notes that Jefferson was a widower by the time of his presidency, and he would have spent Christmas in a forlorn and lonesome mood had it not been for the joyous visits from his grandchildren. At Christmas 1805, Jefferson hosted a Christmas party at the White House for 100 children, including 6 of his grandchildren. The 62-year-old chief executive was said to be so moved by the festivities that he played the fiddle and danced with the children. The invitations had been sent out by Dolly Madison, the vivacious wife of his Secretary of State. When her husband James followed Jefferson as the chief executive, Dolly was well known for hosting fashionable parties, known famously as being a politically neutral space. But in 1814, the White House had been gutted when British soldiers had burned the city in June. The first couple relocated to a townhouse called the Octagon. The White House Historical Association writes that the Octagon House was second in size only to the burned president's house and was the only private home in Washington with the requisite elegance and scale for grand entertaining. The redoubtable Mrs. Madison was said to have resumed her schedule of entertaining, intent on keeping up the public morale, despite complaining that the house was too small and damp. There's no specific record of a Christmas party at Octagon House in 1814, but there's reason to suspect that there would have been one. And they would have had reason to celebrate had they known. The Treaty of Ghent, ending the war, had been agreed upon by his representatives and those of the British Crown on Christmas Eve. Andrew Jackson held a frolic for children at the White House in 1835 that was described by the White House Historical Association as one of the most elaborate parties ever held at the White House. Included in the festivities, amidst the music and mince pies, was an indoor snowball fight using what historian Louise Pettis described as cotton snowballs, lightly frosted, that exploded when struck in a certain manner. Pettis writes that some of the adults must have been reminded of the tumultuous reception that followed Jackson's first inauguration and viewed the scene with apprehension. Among the adult guests was the former First Lady, Dolly Madison. Likewise, the holiday was overshadowed by war during the administration of Abraham Lincoln, but the holiday was recognized. Christmas 1861 would have been a difficult one for the president, dealing with the fallout from the Trent affair, but the website Mr. Lincoln's White House notes that a party was recorded on Christmas evening in 1861, a dinner for friends and administration officials, including 8 members of the extended family of Postmaster General Montgomery Blair. While the celebrations in the White House may have been subdued, their focus was on the soldiers fighting the war. In 1862, Mrs. Lincoln coordinated a donation of turkeys and other fowl for dinners in the military hospitals around Washington, New York, and Baltimore. The New York Times wrote that Mrs. Lincoln was munificent in her bounty. While the White House Historical Association notes that 19th century presidents often brought their own traditions with them and privately celebrated with family and friends, some events were documented. In 1889, President Benjamin Harrison and his wife erected the first known Christmas tree in the White House, a still uncommon tradition in the United States at the time, in the second-floor Oval Room, decorated for the grandchildren. And in 1894, the first Christmas tree lighted with electricity was erected by Grover Cleveland, but these were in the private quarters. The first tree in the working part of the White House may have been in the Blue Room during Christmas 1912, but oddly, the White House Historical Association notes President and Mrs. Taft weren't there to see it, having gone on a trip to Panama. The tree was erected by their 3 oldest children, Robert, Helen, and Charlie, for the benefit of their visiting young cousins. Slowly, traditions developed, and many of those traditions were obvious last week when I walked through security, greeted by officers of the military, and stepped through the North Portico. The North Portico wasn't there for John Adams, but it was designed by James Hoban, the original architect of the White House, which, by the way, was not formalized as the name of the president's house until Theodore Roosevelt had it put on the White House stationery in 1901. The 3-sided stone colonnade was built at Hoban's discretion between 1829 and 1830 to provide a sheltered, formal entrance for carriages and dignitaries arriving at the main public door. It was Hoban's last major addition to the building. He died in 1831. Anyway, through the portico, I entered what is generally today called the Grand Foyer, if you prefer, to hear the Marine Ensemble, called the President's Own, playing Christmas tunes. And that is nothing new. The first known performance of the Marine Band in the White House was on New Year's Day, 1801. In fact, the first New Year for the recently occupied building. In 1902, the Grand Foyer was called the Entrance Hall, and in a major renovation that year, Theodore Roosevelt had a bronze version of the presidential seal, designed by sculptor Philip Martini, set in the floor. But I did not see the so-called Martini seal. Between 1948 and 1952, President Truman oversaw a significant renovation of the aging building that gutted much of the interior, which was in dire need of repair. And during that renovation, he removed the Martini seal and installed the white marble floor that greeted me. Truman felt that it was disrespectful to walk on the seal, and he had the Martini seal moved to above the door of the diplomatic reception room. But in a nod to Teddy's intent, Truman had an ornate plaster seal designed by Ferdinand Breunig placed above the door of the Blue Room. And now for vagabonds like me, wide-eyed visiting the people's house for the first time, it's a commonplace to have a photo taken under that seal, hopefully taken by a young Marine in dress blues, stationed there, I think, to keep the photos moving so as to not jam up the entrance to the cross hall. There were trees everywhere. That was at least a newer tradition, starting with the Eisenhower administration, which had 29 trees placed in the building for Christmas 1951. A record well broken now. There were 98 trees for the 2018 Christmas. This year, there were a relatively modest 51. I mentioned the north portico, but you might be more familiar with the south portico, a more rounded entrance that was designed and installed by Hoban in 1824. But a balcony designed by Lorenzo S. Winslow was added during the Truman renovation. Foreign dignitaries visiting often use the south portico entrance, which is actually a floor lower than the north portico and called the ground floor. The room they enter is the diplomatic reception room, but since the party was limited to the first floor and not the ground floor, I didn't get to see that room and thus missed the Martini seal above its door. Maybe in another visit. Once in the cross hall, I had access to 5 rooms. We weren't allowed into the private dining room or, of course, up the stairs to the residence. So I wandered to the largest room of the residence, conveniently called the East Room, for those who don't know what direction they're facing. It's a big room, 80 feet by 37 feet with a 22-foot high ceiling. And Thursday, it had a long table covered in a lot of food. It was, I'd say, quite a spread, given that the instructions I was emailed had not mentioned food at all at the event, and it was at 3 in the afternoon. I didn't eat much, but I did eat a date, because I hadn't seen a date in years, and I thought it would be funny to say that I found a date at the White House. I'm sorry, I can't vouch for my humor. It is what it is. But anyway, the East Room is largely as it was designed by Hoban. It's so large that when Adams moved in with almost no furniture, they hung laundry to dry, which is something of a contrast to today's shindig, which is a word, by the way, that might have been derived from a Scottish hockey-like game called shinty. But this wasn't the first shindig in this room. In fact, parties in this room predate the word shindig, which only dates back to the 1850s. Because it was in this room, where I now stood, that the Adamses held the first Christmas party in the People's House in 1800. I had to ponder the 225 years between me and the day that Susanna Boylston Adams bit the nose off another girl's doll in this very room, and where Thomas Jefferson played the fiddle with 100 youngsters and Andrew Jackson had his indoor snowball fight. My imagination went far beyond the buffet. And from there I could go through to the cleverly named Green Room, so named because it's green. Designed by Hoban as a dining room, the Adams used it as a guest bedroom, and James Monroe used it as a card room. He was fond of whist and decorated it with green silks, and it's been called the Green Room ever since. There was a nod to the legacy of that gameplay in the decorations, with the Lego versions of George Washington and President Trump, as well as dominoes and cards and cool vintage toys. From there, I wandered into the Blue Room, which wasn't originally blue. This was a formal reception space that Martin Van Buren first decorated in blue in 1837. It is directly below the yellow oval room where Benjamin Harrison built the first Christmas tree in 1889, and the room where the Taft children erected the tree in 1912. And since maybe Eisenhower is the place where a tree has traditionally always been placed at Christmas, which since 1961 has been decorated with a theme, a trend started by Jackie Kennedy in 1961. The tree in the Blue Room is the official tree, and this year it is 18 feet tall, and it comes, I am told, from Corson's Tree Farms in Sidney, Michigan, the national champion growers this year, according to the National Christmas Tree Association. Ornaments this year represented the birds and flowers from each state. Trees aside, in 1828, John Adams II, grandson of President John Adams and son of President John Quincy Adams, was married in this room to Mary Catherine Helen in 1828. And President Grover Cleveland and Francis Folsom were married here in the Blue Room in 1886. Dwight Eisenhower's granddaughter, Mary Jean Eisenhower, was christened in this room during Eisenhower's first term. Among the many portraits in the room is the portrait of John Adams, painted by John Trumbull, watching out to make sure that nobody bites the nose off a doll. Jefferson's in there too, painted by Rembrandt Peale, still enjoying the mirth and jollity, and William Howard Taft, during whose administration the Christmas tree was first erected in this room, hangs above the door. Next door is the Red Room, ironically named since the Blue Room was first decorated in red, but originally this room was yellow, and the room was designed by Hoban as an antechamber. It's been generally used as a parlor, first painted red in 1882. As a parlor, music was often played here. Thomas Jefferson kept a magpie in a cage in this room, brought back by Lewis and Clark's Corps of Discovery. There's no record of whether the magpie had a name, but Jefferson did have a northern mockingbird named Dick, who was allowed to freely fly around the White House, which probably annoyed the caged magpie, and would have been an issue later with any number of famous presidential cats. Purportedly, Dick sang while Jefferson played his fiddle, which was likely in this very room. The tree this year is decorated with blue butterflies and ornaments that advertise the First Lady's Be Best initiative. Next door is the White House State Dining Room with more food. This is a special place, really. Originally, it was quite small, owing to a staircase. Jefferson used it as his office and kept his gardening tools in here. Adams held levees here, a place where visitors could come in and chat with the president. Dolly Madison had a much larger version every Wednesday down in the East Room. Dolly Madison is on the wall in this room now, painted by Gilbert Stuart in 1804. She's on the north end, which was a stair until the Roosevelt renovation in 1902, and now looks all the way across 3 rooms and 4 doors to the full-length portrait of Washington, also painted by Gilbert Stuart, and which, by legend, she personally saved from the British in 1814, although historians today doubt that story and think that Washington's portrait was likely saved by a servant instead. But still, the 2 portraits facing each other is a reminder that this whole place was once gutted by those darn Brits. On the north end of the room was a 120-pound gingerbread White House. A reproduction is made each year by the White House chef with a theme. This year it was Home is Where the Heart Is, a tradition that was started by First Lady Pat Nixon in 1969, although gingerbread houses go back much further, and I'll probably do an episode on that at some point. I'm told that no, they don't eat the gingerbread, which will have grown stale and been moved several times by the time the season ends. If you ask them what they do with it, what they tell you is that they send it to the North Pole, which is an obvious lie. But this is Washington, D.C., so there's bigger lies around. But there's also a fireplace in the room, and I was looking forward to seeing that fireplace. In 1902, when Theodore Roosevelt moved the stairs, he redid the mantels. The original had lions in the corner, and he thought that was too European, and so replaced them with mantels that had bison carved on the corner. And that is cool. I mean, who else has bison on their mantle? My high school football team was the bison. My college football team was the buffaloes, which is funny that the high school had a better understanding of the actual species than the university. But still, bison fireplaces, that's cool. But Truman removed those mantles in the 1948 renovation. But President Kennedy replaced the Truman mantle with a reproduction of the Roosevelt mantle in 1962. So, go Buffs. Roosevelt had a moose head hanging above the mantle because Theodore Roosevelt, but that's now in the Smithsonian because, who throws away a moose head. But now above the fireplace is George Peter Alexander Healy's portrait of Abraham Lincoln. And it is probably my favorite presidential portrait as far as I can do favorites. It just shows me the weight of the office. Lincoln sat for it in 1864, but it wasn't completed until 1869. And funny thing, Grant didn't choose it, so it went to Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, who is an interesting guy in his own right, but was eventually passed down to his daughter, Mary Lincoln Isham, who bequeathed it to the White House upon her death in 1939 on the promise that they display it. Anyway, it's a beautiful mantle, but there is another twist, because in 1945, President Franklin Roosevelt added an inscription to the mantle, which was included in the JFK reproduction. And it is that blessing that John Adams wrote to Abigail the day after he moved into the White House on November 2nd, 1800. I pray to heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof. There is so much more I could say and so much more I could talk about. As you can tell, I was kind of like a kid in a candy store. In fact, they were literally giving away candy. But honestly, for much of it, I was uncomfortable because I'm really kind of an introvert, and there were 200 people there, and I knew just one of them. They didn't really tell us in the invitation where the introverts were supposed to hide. And yeah, some of those people were important, powerful in their time, and that's cool. They'll probably be, making history in their various ways, though I was maybe more interested in the fireplace mantles. But that means that we should get to the elephant in the room because it is the president's house, and that means that a politician lives there, and people have feelings about politicians, sometimes quite strident feelings, as I found out when I posted just a few pictures on Facebook. And I understand that, but I left my politics at the door, as I always try to do, because I don't think you need some historian telling you what to think of your time. But I would have accepted this invitation under any administration. And so if you want to, yell about this president, whether you like him or whether you hate him, if you want to tell me that you're disappointed in me, or you think that I shouldn't have accepted this invitation this year, just don't even bother writing that down, because you'll be wasting your time, because I'm going to be removing all of those comments. And it's not because politics aren't important. Of course politics are important. Why study history if we can't apply it to the present? But the thing is, there are so many places for you to go yell about politics on the World Wide Web, and one of the things that I like to be is a respite from that. And the fact is, this is neither the place nor the time, because the place is the people's house, and the time is Christmas. And for 225 years, through triumph and disaster, through weddings and whist, through war and fire and illness, through 45 presidents and mockingbirds and other weird pets, through all the things this nation has faced, we've managed to celebrate Christmas at the people's house. And that deserves to be remembered. Merry Christmas. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.